Well, everyone, I'm Mohammad Tavakkoli, the inaugural director of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto. I welcome you all to another inspiring season of our weekly Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali seminar series, Iranian Cinema and Women Poets, which I am co-convening with my colleagues, Professor Rivan Sandler and Professor Azita Talagani. At the outset, I'd like to express our collective gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of Credit River. Today, this meeting place continues to be the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work and prosper on their ancestral land. I'd like to welcome Dr. Razak of the Center for Modern Indian Studies at Göttingen University. My colleague, Professor Rivan Sandler, will be introducing Dr. Khan and will moderate today's session on Tainted Veil, Desire, Poetry, and Subjectivity in the Persianate literary culture of South Asia. Professor Sandler.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tavakkoli. Dr. Khan, it is my pleasure to introduce you. Dr. Khan is a research fellow in the History Research Group at the University of Göttingen. He has published various articles on Urdu public and performance culture and archives in India and Germany. He recently edited, quote, The Incomparable Festival, a Penguin Black Classic 2021, and his book, Minority Pasts, Locality, Emotions, and Belonging. He recently edited The Incomparable Festival, Penguin Black Classic, and his book, Minority Pasts, Locality, Emotions, and Belonging in Princely Rampur is forthcoming with Oxford University Press in 2022. Dr. Khan, I will leave you to take over now. You are much more fluid in what you are doing, and I won't say any more and try and give an abstract or anything like that. You are the best person to explain what your interests and your specialties are. Dr. Khan, please come in.
Yeah, merci, Professor Sandler, merci, Professor Thargi. Can you hear me at this stage?
Yes.
Very good. I'll also appreciate if you mute the mic because I'll be playing some sound files. So it would help, otherwise there'll be an echo. Okay, on that note, let's begin. Okay, so this lecture series is about poets and poetry. So following the norms, I must begin with the praise of my host, Professor Mohammad Tavakkoli Thargi. He has been a source of inspiration through his pathbreaking work, not just on Iran, but also on South Asia. In fact, he is somebody who wrote one of the earliest articles on the Rampur Razak Library collection, when he also theorized a very important concept, the concept of the homeless text of Persianate modernity. This essay was very influential for my own turn to Rampur, which unfortunately has not been studied in English language. It has an extensive scholarship in Urdu though. Okay, so thank you for writing that essay and inspiring other people to pursue this work.
Thank you.
Professor Thargi continues to not only make an individual contribution, but also created collective spaces like this wonderful colloquium on what he calls Zoomistan, a very important formulation for our times. I joined this colloquium as I'm interested in thinking about affinities but also differences within the category of the Persianate, not just as a shared literary space, but also one with differences and divergences. South Asia, particularly what is often called the Indo-Persianate, precisely is that geography of poetry that allows rethinking both Persianate and Persian. I hope to do so in this paper by looking at Urdu poetry after the abolition of Persian in colonial India, but also sort of look at its literary legacy in princely India in late 19th century. Rampur, as well as Delhi, Lucknow, Calcutta, and Hyderabad, becomes part of this larger geography, what Shahab Ahmed has famously called the Balkan to Bengal complex. And I'll sort of try to destabilize that geography. A second reason this colloquium series appealed to me was its sustained focus on poetry, not just as a literary genre or form of expression, but also as an archive. I'm not a literary scholar, but a historian of emotions and archive. With interest in, this is my non-academic interest in Lacanian psychoanalysis, but over the years, I have also come to see Lacanian psychoanalysis as a historical method, as a method to read text and archive. Therefore, following this perspective, and I'll explain this as the talk proceeds, I think of poetry as an affective archive of emotion, but not through the conventional history of emotion, which is interested in expression of emotion, which I think is limiting. Whereas a psychoanalytical approach would be more interested in the unexpressed, repressed emotions. So in this talk, I'll be sort of looking at not just expressed emotion, but the unexpressed, the conscious, as well as the unconscious. The archive fetish of what Derrida calls archive fever of the historian emotion has been enriched by the promise of a psychoanalytically informed reading of poetry, which allows beyond the surface reading of the text and author to a deeper analysis, and I use the word analysis in a psychoanalytical way, of the unconscious desire and subject formation. And the word subject is important, not just for authorship, but in that sense about subject formation and subjectification through poetry. So I do this in this presentation by exploring the most important literary expression, which in South Asia, Iran, and large part of the world, in fact, is not prose, but poetry. In this paper, I'll be looking at three genres: ghazal, masnavi, and rethink poetry. A note about poetry and genre therefore become important. So the genres are important, and I'll come to them because I want to argue that ghazal, masnavi, and rethink in particular, destabilizes this idea that there is a global Persianate modernity or there's a global Persianate genre form. And I want to suggest that Urdu has to be studied not just as a child of Persian, but it should be studied on its own basis, not to make a nationalist argument of Urdu as an Indian language, but perhaps to destabilize the idea of Persianate nationalism itself, and to argue that what is more productive is to think of not similarities, but also differences and divergences. Why is it that Reiki developed in India and not elsewhere? Okay. Now, another related innovation made in this colloquium has been a sustained attention to the presence of poetess in a world where women have often been studied as objects and not the subject of poetry. Now, this remarkable colloquium series has not only brought to light history of female, feminine, or women's poetry, and issues of creativity of women's writing. This is both an important and a difficult question in the contemporary moment. As Jacqueline Rose has recently argued in her important book on violence and on violence against women, that we live in a time where women are facing unprecedented violence. This has once again revealed the unbearable violence that constitutes the formation of the category of women itself as a sex subject. We also live in a time where many are critiquing and demanding to open the category of a woman, and I'm here referring to the trans and non-binary discourse about who is a woman. This pull and push on the definition and identity of who is a woman is also a literary and a psychoanalytical question. Thus also raising another question: is there something called women's writing? There is no consensus on this issue. scholars, institutes on women's studies are being criticized for being exclusionary. This is both an important identity politics question, but also an epistemological question of the present. However, we risk misreading or misinterpreting history from the contemporary moment into the literary archive. It seems to me that scholars of poetry, particularly Persian, with its own gender non-confirming, one might even call it a post-gender pre-modern poetry, tradition has something to provide answers to these difficult questions, or what Judith Butler calls the gender trouble. I wish to move away from Butler's argument of a performative theory of gender, sexuality, and one may add poetry to the list. It seems to me that the performative theory of gender has both helped and restricted any deeper attention to issues of embodied desire, psychic life of sex, a concept that Butler also works with, and the question of the silent subaltern subject and the impossibility of what Gayatri Spivak calls the project of recovering or making the subaltern speak, and the impossibility of that project. Therefore, in this paper, I wish to highlight engagement with psychoanalysis, particularly Lacanian psychoanalysis, as a historical method of reading poetry with and beyond the gender category. Poetry is also what French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan calls the site of subject formation. And perhaps it's a good time to read an important quote by Lacan, and I leave you with the quote on the screen. This quote represents something important, which is poetry as a site of subject formation and articulation, as well as repression of the desire for the other. The connection between psychoanalysis, language, and subject formation has brought into what Yulia Kristeva, a Lacanian-inspired literary and linguistic scholar, famously calls revolution in poetic language. And I'll come to Kristeva when I conclude, because I differ from her argument that psychoanalysis should not focus so much on the life of the poet, but on the text. As a historian, I think the biographical and the textual needs to be brought into conversation. Okay, but let's move ahead now. And I want to say something about Lacan's argument here, to think of the poem and not the poet. The argument that Lacan is making in this quote is in fact not that profound, but an obvious fact of life. This colloquium series has already illuminated some of these troubling questions and offered important interventions. I'm here thinking particularly about the talks given in this series by Farzaneh Milani, Fatemeh Shams, and Niloufar Khairi, and Professor Zuzana Olszewska in this series. All of them offered different ways of thinking about the sides of finding women's subjectivity and poetry in performance. And these are important words that I draw from their presentation. So performance is one, and I want to think of performance as an important side of poetry. Remember, these are not just text. Poetry was a performative genre. So thinking of performance as a category through poetry. The other category that was brought was embodiment by Professor Khairi, and also the concept of threshold, something that Professor Milani brought into this discussion. I would like to add the psychoanalytical space as a productive space between embodiment and performance. One may call it both a threshold as well as the center, the courtyard of women's subject formation and creative expression. Farooqzad, who has been a constant presence in many of the lectures on poetry as well as on cinema series, another very important series run by Professor Saragi, as a poet left us with a history, a life of desire, sex, and psyche. It is this psychoanalytical element in her poetry that appeals not just to heterosexual women, but also men and non-heteronormative subjects. Her House of Black, or Khana Asia, can perhaps be read as a symbol of the unconscious darkness, and also the desire for doors, windows, and the light that we all desire. So in a way, I think the Farooqzad legacy is important precisely because it can appeal across gender, because it strikes a chord with the psychoanalytical power of the poetic. Now, with this larger digression, which I believe was necessary, to return to history as not just as a site of information, but also as a site of transference between the poets and the reader that I now turn to in my presentation. I will be reading three poets, and I'm using these words in a binary mode for a reason. Three of these poets include a man, a woman, and a gender non-confirming or a gender-bending poet, Mir-Djalali Sahib. I use these binary categories to bring a certain tension into how we think of poetry. Poetry has its own processes of subject formation, and like psychoanalysis, there are in fact no men and women, but there are subject formation or the processes of subjectification in the relationship with the phallic. This is how Lacan would explain subject formation, that it is precisely in relationship with the phallic or the law of the father, and one may even add the law of the mother, that subject formation happens. This is a good moment to turn to our first poet, Dagh, and his resolution of what people would call the Freudian Madonna-whore complex, which is to think of women either as saint or as whore, and the desire for one and the impossibility to be with the other one. Now, here of course, I'm indebted to the magnum opus of Professor Shamsur Rahman Farooqi on Wazir Khanum, the mother of Dagh Dehlvi, which is both available in Urdu and English through Penguin. And that remarkable work sort of focused on the life of this extraordinary woman, Wazir Khanum, who also wrote poetry. But in today's talk, I'll be talking about the other woman in Dagh Dehlvi's life. This is Munni by Hiiab. So it's a good time to turn to our poet. And before I turn to Dagh and his oeuvre, I'm hoping I can play this video.
लुत्फ वो इश्क में पाए हैं कि जी जानता है, लुत्फ वो इश्क में पाए हैं कि जी जानता है। जो ज़माने के सितम है वो ज़माना जाने, तूने दिल इतने सताए हैं कि जी जानता है, जी जानता है कि जी जानता है। महफिल बरखास्त हुई, पतंगे रुखसत शमों से हो रहे हैं। दुनिया का ये रंग और हम, दुनिया का ये रंग और हम, कुछ होश नहीं है सो रहे हैं, कुछ होश नहीं है सो रहे हैं।
बेगम बहुत खूब, मजा आ गया।
आपकी दाग की नज़म तो मेरे दिल में उतर गई।
लेकिन ये दाग तो हल्के हो जाएंगे।
ये दाग तो मिट जाएगा सईदा बेगम, लेकिन उस दाग का क्या जो आपने इस दिल पे लगाए।
चलिए, आज से आप हमारे दाग साहब।
The video basically is a video of the recently developed Netflix series or the BBC series, A Suitable Boy, which starts with the performance of a Dagh ghazal by Sahib, who plays a courtesan with love affair with a young respectable boy called Man. And the performance of this Dagh ghazal is important because it brings into light Sahib's invocation of Dagh as a legacy which she performs. And perhaps in the end, I will come back to another performance of a ghazal of Dagh by Sahib in the end. So there might be an opportunity to play it later. But let's move ahead with Dagh, whom you see here, who was an important poet in the colonial era. One might even call him as the link between the last Persianate modern Urdu poet Ghalib and the more famous Persianate poet of the 20th century, Iqbal, who considered him as his master. Dagh, of course, is a missing link in the sense that I think despite immense and interesting work on him in Urdu, he has not received enough attention in the English scholarship. And I'll come to a reason on why that is. Here you see him in his time in Rampur. So Dagh, of course, has a very interesting personal life. His mother led a very interesting life and carried the stain of her multiple marriages, of one of which was with the Nawab of Loharu, from which Dagh was born. And she subsequently also married to the son of last ruler of Delhi, Bahadur Shah Zafar. And she ensured that Dagh does not carry the stain of her past. And she ensured that he was properly hired in the Rampur port, where he lived for many years despite the turbulence of 1857. Rampur was a major princely patron center and patronized various poets, including Ghalib. But Dagh was one of the major poets at the court. Other poets included Amir Minai and our second poet, Mir-Djalali Jan Sahib. Now, these years of Dagh in Rampur have, I think, not been adequately studied, and so has not been the further life of his in Hyderabad and other places. The focus on Rampur is not to emphasize how wonderful it was for him, but in his own word, Rampur was Arampur, or the place of comfort, where he received patronage for a long time, and this allowed him to flourish and write a whole set of work. Now, what is important at this stage is to remember how Dagh has been commented upon within literary scholarship. And one of the ways that he has been dismissed is because his poetry does not carry high Persianate register and is in fact considered simple or of surface emotion. These are the words of one of the major Urdu literary scholar, Ram Babu Saxena, who dismisses his poetry as a poetry meant for courtesan and dancing girls. But a more considerate analysis of his work by scholars suggests that he did not only take the idea of poetry to philosophical height, but also engage with the experience of love at a human level, therefore bringing it close to eroticism. Yeah. Cumulatively, he is also more playful with the language, Persianized in his diction, but witty in his turn of phrases, and also full of simplicity, but also a more natural or more humane, urbane touch to Urdu poetry. So he has written 4 divans and has produced a whole set of letters, very beautiful archives of letters that he wrote, but also one of the last major example of Masnavi called Faryad-e-Dagh, which he wrote for his love affair with Munni by Hiiab. Now, as I'll come to the question of how Masnavi from its spiritual Sufi history is turned into more humane love in Faryad-e-Dagh. And there is a way in which this is dismissed, but I think he's doing something very interesting in Faryad-e-Dagh. Now, the reason of such dismissal is that although not fully taken seriously by literary scholars, Dagh was famously very popular among courtesans and singers, and has been perhaps most well sung poet by legendary Ghazal singers, including Begum Akhtar, Noor Jahan, Malika Pokhraj, Farida Khanum, among others. Now, why does this matter? What is it about courtesan singing Dagh that sort of is both a problem but also a possibility, is something that I want to explore in this paper. And I want to turn by looking at how this presence of a courtesan in Dagh life happens. This we know through another text. This is a text written by another poet in Rampur in the 1860s. The Nawab of Rampur, Elahé Khan, who himself was a poet, started this festival called Jasht-e-Benazir in 1865-66. And it is at this festival that Dagh met the courtesan Munni by Hiiab. Now, this is a text which is about a visual and lyrical description of this festival. It is in the genre of rethink, which is often written as language of women's voice or sentiment written by men. This is a particularly distinct genre that has origin in Dakhini, Punjabi, but Jan Sahib in that sense is one of the last major poets. And this is perhaps one of the last major musaddas and long-term format of a Rekhti poetry. This text is not about private life of women, but it is about public festivals where there were a variety of actors, and Jan Sahib describes them in this text. It's now available with a translation by Shad Naved and out now globally from Penguin in January 2022. I'll refrain from saying more about this text at this stage, but perhaps this also forms part of my forthcoming book on Rampur, where I discuss this era in Rampur as a period of what I've called in the book an era of poetic sovereignty in period of colonial paramountcy. And what I've argued essentially there is to look at poetry as a way of thinking about sovereignty when it has been lost, something that both Bahadur Shah Zafar and the last Nawab of Awadh, Wajid Ali Shah, also employed. So I sort of think of poetry in a historical formation, not just about personal sentiment, but about historical transition as well. Okay, maybe this is a good time to move to our main actor in this story. So in Jasht-e-Benazir, you have both versified description as well as a visual archive. And here you see one description of a courtesan, and I want to bring also the words of the courtesan. Now, in the visual, you'd see a courtesan mentioned as Munni. So this is not Munni by Hiiab, but the description matches some of the qualities of Hiiab, who was a poetess courtesan from Calcutta or Kolkata, and was proficient not just in music and dance, but also poetry. Now, the Hiiab is not known to us in her own representation most of the time. Her representation comes to us mediated by Mir text. So this is a selection of her poetry is now increasingly available in various texts. A major text where we find her in a very first iteration is Tazkiratul Khawatir. Yeah. And then from that, we know that she was learning poetry in Kolkata and was a very well-known courtesan, and who was pursued by both patrons, but also poets. I'll come to her own description that I've highlighted here. And I want to focus both on the matla and makta in this ghazal because of the way she plays with her words, which is an important argument I want to make, the takhallus, which is Hiiab. So here is a courtesan with the poetic pseudonym of Hiiab, the veiled one, or the one with modesty. Whereas our first poet, Dagh Dehlvi, whose mother constantly tried to get her in respectability, chooses a pseudonym or a poetic name of Dagh, the tainted, the scarred, or the wounded one. And I have something to say about why such names or poetic name were used. Jan Sahib, of course, used Jan as a poetic name poetic name normally used by courtesans. The famous Umrao Jan Ada, of course, had Jan in her title. So there is a way in which I want to suggest that there might not be much in the name, but there is something in the poetic name, because it does function centrally in the poetry. As you see here, both in the matla and the vakta, that hijab is being used in a very interesting way. So in this case, for example, she's saying that the condition of concealment or the condition of modesty cannot be described without it being a very tear-filled story, what she called a dastan, which is full of tears. Aansu na tapke sun ke ye wo dastan nahi. A second play that she does on the word of hijab is where she talks about वो और मेरे घर में चले आए हैं खुद ब खुद सर पर मेरे हिजाब मगर आसमान नहीं. Here she's playing with the category of hijab both as a veil but also as her own subjectivity, as a woman whose visitors, whose patrons would show up at her home, and she is yet lamenting that although there is a veil on my head, but there is no sky. Or the play on the word asman is also very interesting, and I love to hear how different people interpret here. It is not just about that she is vain or her head is in the sky. It can also be read in very different way, that although she has people visiting her, she is in fact without a home of her own, in the sense of not being able to make a home with someone. It can also be read in a more philosophical way, in terms of somebody with a veil but without a sky over her head. What does that might mean? And the way hijab is playing with the word hijab, both in terms of her own name, but also her poetic name, and what I would also argue with the concept of modesty or concealment. Okay, let's move ahead at this stage. I have also looked at the letters that just to summarize a very long and turbulent love story, Dagh and Hiiab meet in Rampur and they have a turbulent love affair because she was also being courted by other patrons, including one of the relatives of Nawab at the estate of Pilsi. And Dagh completely is besotted by her. And I think the admiration was mutual because Dagh was a very famous poet. And this love affair is turbulent but consistent for many years. And Dagh pursues hijab not just in Rampur, but also in Calcutta. He writes a full Masnavi for her, and the Masnavi is about the turbulent love affair. Something that is important to note that he is in fact not hiding this. He's very much actually advertising it and creatively writing about it. For various reasons, and their love story is quite dramatic. They are never able to live together, although Dagh visits her in Calcutta, and subsequently she visits him in Hyderabad. But for various familial and social reasons, they are not able to marry. But they continue a life through text, which are letters that they write to each other. And these are beautiful, interesting letters, in all of whom Dagh actually constantly plays with the word Dagh and hijab. So there's a recurring presence of these two words in their letters. So Dagh, for example, is constantly talking about his own name, and both as something that brings him name, but also a bad name. So for example, here he writes in one of the letters here. Yeah, so these letters provide an affective archive of love, longing, desperation, cajoling, anger, resentment, care, affection, and a gamut of other emotions. They range from Dagh's making offer to buy hijab a house, offer servants, making plans to visit Calcutta, or worrying about his beloved's welfare. They are also quite interesting archive about thinking about aging and love. So there are a lot of letters about his old age and his concern about love and affection from hijab, and also hijab's own family. So it's not just a hijab that he is interested in. He's interested in hijab's poetic work. He's interested in what's happening in her wider life. So Dagh, hijab and Dagh continues to be in each other's life, and therefore the title of the presentation as the Tainted Veil, which is a wordplay on Dagh and hijab. It seems this long-standing romance had created widespread notoriety, and a variety of texts were written about this poet courtesan love affair. So, for example, Sayyid Muhammad Mehdi wrote Munni by Hiiab, Mirza Dagh ki shakhsiyat aur unke Urdu zamanon par adharit Sampurna Natak, which is a detailed drama written on the love affair of Dagh and Munni by Hiiab. This, of course, was written much later, but is based, in fact, on an essay by Abdul Qadir, which was published already in the magazine Shama in 1926. So this obviously brought a lot of writing on this love affair. Now, in this account, in these various renderings, in fact, Hiiab appears not just as a courtesan, but in various ways she starts appearing also as a poetess. And so for example, in one observation by Tamkin Kazmi, in his introduction to Faryad-e-Dagh in 1956, he does actually acknowledge that Hiiab was not just a Dere-Data wife or courtesan, but she was, as he calls her, a sacha ashik, a true lover, who remained in touch with Dagh even when they were not living together. Although it is important that despite this acknowledgement, which is very typical of Urdu literary criticism, they will pass a snide remark and also make a reference to her, her being a prostitute. And in the same introduction, he also makes a very nasty remark about Dagh's own mother's scandalous past. Now, this constant referencing of the mother and lover's scandalous public woman history is something that is a recurring theme even in subsequent writing on this. So, for example, in this play that I talked about, this is constantly referred that in fact Hiiab was having other love affair with Chuttan Sahib in Bilsi. It very strangely, his sister character is named as Naqab. So there's Hiiab and Naqab. So two courtesans are being named. So there is a recognition of why is this woman using a poetic name of Hiiab, and her daughter, her sister, is named Naqab. The same play also makes a nasty reference to Dagh's mother's, who's now named as the Choti Begum, or the younger wife of her older husband. Now, this is perhaps a good time to come to what I have suggested is the question of nom de plume, or the poetic name. And here are the key references to these names. Now, the category of takhallus is very interesting because although it is a shared category between Arabic, Persian, and Urdu, I think its functions are different. And I was having a wonderful conversation with Marjan the other day about its function in Farsi, where you have also laqab and takhallus, making a distinction both about a place of origin versus the name. In Urdu, takhallus function at both levels. So in Dagh Dehlvi, Dehlvi is of course about his place origin, but Dagh of course is the chosen one there, and he's mostly known as Dagh. So it's true in fact for Ghalib as well, whom we know through his poetic name. And I think it would be Rauf Parekh has written a wonderful article in Dawn, where he makes a very interesting observation that in English literature or Western literature, the poetic name or the pseudonym were sites for women to conceal their identity, to appear as men, whereas in Urdu, poetic names are not about concealment, they are in fact about revelation. And of course, there are Urdu novel writers who have used this for concealment, but it could be argued that the poetic name in Urdu literature often has a literary purpose, as I showed in the example of the Matlai Makta, that it's not just about having any name, it actually informs your poetic output. So there is an interesting way to think about the poet through their poetic name. This is the argument I'm suggesting, and I'll be open to hearing a difference of opinion on this. Okay, so the takhallus, of course, sometimes can create funny situation, as Shad Naved has pointed that Ghasid Tausi, the great Orientalist observer, in his writing on Jan Sahib, of course, thought that Jan Sahib is a woman, and he listed him as a woman poet of this time. So, so this was, of course, also intentional. I think Jan Sahib chose a woman's takhallus because he was the master of the Reti poetry, but it sometimes can create funny and interesting stories in the archive. Okay. So in that sense, choosing a poetic name of hijab, I suggest, is important because the courtesan poet claiming the place of the speaking as a hijabi poet is an interesting observation, because hijab indeed was not pursuing only money or patronage. She, in fact, wanted to be recognized as a poet or a modest poet. And you can see this in her poetic output, that there is a great investment both in religion, but also in the concept of modesty or concealment rather than revelation. Yeah. Okay. So now perhaps it's a good time for me to slowly come to the conclusion. I just also wanted to, as anecdotal event, but I think these anecdotes are important as to how the takhallus is constantly being used and abused by critics against poets. So Dagh's takhallus, of course, earned him both a lot of praise, but also variety of nasty comments and observation about his work. So here is Abdul Wadud Beg, who says, and I quote, "Dagh's poetry fell from the sky to the whorehouse, then danced into the night." This is, of course, reference to his own stained past with various prostitutes. Firaq Gorakhpuri, who has been celebrated as a queer icon, says something even nastier, but also interesting, I think. He says Dagh turned debauchery into a sort of genius. And I've already mentioned other observation about Dagh's poetry, where he's being condemned basically to talk about eroticism, to talk about sensuous delight, and to legitimize a courtesan as a subject of poetic output, because he doesn't hide it. He's willfully saying that this is about my lover, who's in fact also lover of many other people, who is in fact marketing her body. And this, I think, is very interesting because he's not at all judgmental about it. And he's very open about his own multiple relationship with various courtesans. Now, with this backdrop to both their life and poetic output, I want to now slowly come to a conclusion. And let's see if we can play this video.
कहिए ना सजा, कहिए 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 मुझे बुरा, कहिए ना रवा, कहिए ना सजा, जाने दमे आखिर को इब्तिदा, कहिए दमे आखिर को इब्तिदा, कहिए 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 मुझे बुरा, कहिए ना रवा, कहिए ना सजा, कहिए सब्र फुरकत में आ ही जाता आशना, कहिए पर उसे कहिए 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 मुझे बुरा कहिए
Okay, so I invoke the second reiteration of Dagh in a very important story-like plot of the play. For those who have seen, Dagh is invoked both first at the encounter of the courtesan poet Saidabai with man, but also in the place of separation. So Dagh is both a poet of great sensuality, but also a great narrator of longing for love. And I thought this was a wonderful way to think of Dagh's oeuvre, not just about eroticism, but also in a more deeper philosophical and psychoanalytical way. So I will now conclude with Dagh's word. So Dagh, of course, has also famously written, "Urdu hai jiska naam, hum jante hain Dagh, Hindustan mein dhum hamari zaban ki hai." So Dagh, of course, he is talking about his own mastery of Urdu and how that language has brought both name to his own Daghi name. So the invocation of Dagh here is again very interesting. So Dagh, of course, now could not unite with Munni Bai, and he lies buried in Hyderabad. And the only monument of this history is, in fact, this personal history is an archive in poetry and in the letters exchange, an epistolary archive. Now, what insight can we get from this poetic biography, or what I'm calling a life in poetry? First, that we must think of intersubjectivity rather than authorship. We must also think of intertextuality and not just as textual mastery. We should think of text in conversation with performance, and therefore the constant reimagining of Dagh, including in Meera Nair's adaptation of Dagh, which I thought was very useful for the storyline, says something about how Dagh continues to be read, reread, and reinterpreted. Poetry written by male poets here becomes a feminine one. So notice that in both these, in the drama, the poetry is in fact in the sound of Saidabai, and it sort of conveys actually a whole set of different emotional registers in the drama. So poetry written by male poets become a feminine one when performed by female singer, but also a psychoanalytical reading will reveal that it is present even at the textual level. A good example is also of Faiz Ahmed Faiz Nazam being adapted by Noor Jahan, where Faiz in fact agreed that it is no longer his creation because Noor Jahan has performed it so well and so differently that it is no longer just about a Marxist revolution. Noor Jahan made it also a revolution in love. So this allows for a better reading. And I think I'm here also referring to Kala Partovich's new work on women's ghazal singer and what does the sung ghazal tell us about the textual ghazal. Okay, so there is a poetic truth about the poetic name chosen by these three poets: a respectable man with a connection to the Mughal court, an employed in princely court who continued to write as the tainted, the scarred, the wounded one, a courtesan who wrote poetry as the veiled one, and a man who continued to write with the takhallus of the Jan, the dear beloved, often used by courtesans. Perhaps it is this deep-seated relationship between subjectivity and poetry that connects these three poets. Poetry as a way of dealing with inner turmoil, but also the conflicted nature of human desire. And this is perhaps a good time to return to the Lacan quote. As Lacan puts it, and I quote, "Man's desires is the desire of the other." It is not the obvious conscious, but the unconscious where desire emerges. Another important point to remember is desire is always inscribed in and mediated by language. This is an important point that Lacan raises. In the Lacanian perspective, desire can only happen because we are caught up in a linguistic, sexual, and social relations. The whole field of what is then inscribed as the other, which sort of generates these tensions. Language becomes important side to think of not just the poetry, but also the poet. After all, the subject in Lacanian reading is an effect of language. The unconscious is structured, in fact, in Lacanian understanding as language, yeah, in the sense that it is about signifying processes. And the task of a reader, like an analyst, must therefore be not just about deciphering, but also the task of listening, like an analyst. In that sense, the project of translating a poet, therefore, should not just be about explaining a literal fidelity. One might also think of translation as transference in the Lacanian terminology, a project of rendering something much more complicated. And I suppose this is the challenge we have been dealing in this series. How does one read what we call the women's poetry? So I'll end with that. Thank you. Yeah, I've taken my time, but perhaps it's a good time to invite Professor Danish Iqbal has joined us. He's working on a drama on the life of Munni by Hiiab and Dagh Dehlvi. And I thought it would be wonderful to open it as not just one person reading, but a multiple reading of this text. So Professor Danish Iqbal, if you are still in the room at 4 o'clock in morning of India, I welcome you to say your work about Dagh and Munni by Hiiab before we open it up to the audience.
Yes, yes. Thank you. I'm very much here. And while listening to you, so many memories were coming to my mind. I'm working on a stage play, or rather on a dance drama for a very famous Indian artist, for a very famous Indian dancer. Her name is Manjari Chaturvedi. So recently, I collaborated with her and I wrote another dance drama, which was about Dara Shikoh and a fictitious character and the relationship. So it was a Sufi, interpretation of, love and longing. Now she has commissioned this play. She has asked me to write this play specifically about Dagh and Munni by Hiiab, because she has been consistently working to highlight the contribution which was made by courtesans and tawaifs, and how their contribution has been, has been appropriated, or patriarchy has not given them proper credit for being the great women performers and dancers and singers and poets. My research, I owe most of the initiative to Manjari Chaturvedi because she gave me this subject. But I started reading about Munni by Hiiab, and it was a revelation that she's painted in gray colors, as if she was a prostitute. She was not a prostitute. She was a performer. Today we have so many great performers from Bollywood, and they are so respected in India and internationally. So similarly, Munni by Hiiab was a very well-read woman of her times, and she was able to understand English, speak a little English, speak little Bengali, and she was very good in Urdu, and she was so good in Urdu that she was writing beautiful poetry. Dagh was a great poet, but Dagh never met a woman of her capacity. She was beautiful, she was charming, and she was a great poet. And the kind of poetry she was writing at that time, even he was very appreciative. And there's a very famous book. It is called Roznamcha of Dagh. Rafiq Marharbi, Sayyid Rafiq Marharbi has written this. He stayed there with Dagh when he was in Hyderabad for 2-3 years, and he used to write what happened at a particular day. So he has written that when she recited one of her poem, one ghazal, Dagh was appreciating at 2-3 places. He said, "Wow!" Wow, beautiful. And she sang it and presented it so beautifully. So Munni by Hijab was following the tradition of Amir Khusro, because Amir Khusro was a poet and was a performer. Most of the Urdu poets, they were not performers. The way they recited poetry, presented poetry, it was not very beautiful. So she was a trained dancer and a trained singer. And now I remember a small, rubai which Dagh has written, to appreciate, her influence. He says, "Tum to falake husn pe ho mahe muni." He's addressing Munni by Hijab, and he's saying that you are a Mahe Munir, you are a complete moon on Falake Husn, on the sky of beauty. You are just perfect. Sae ki tarha, saath daag dil ki. And when there's a moon, there's a halo, there's a darker halo, and that dark halo is Dagh himself. And she used to have, it is said that, she was having a little mole on her lower lip. So he says, Khale labe gulfam hai shahid iska. So this mole is witness to, what I'm saying. Bedagh na khish saki tumhari tasveer. So, your picture or your photo. There's a reference that when she visited, Hyderabad, he asked her to, get a photograph also. So, Razak Sahib was talking about a famous ghazal which she wrote. This ghazal is mentioned in Bazm-e Dagh also. And she says, हाले हिजाब काबिलो शरहे बयां नहीं आंसू न टपके सुन के ये वो दास्तां नहीं दिल में जिगर में सीने में पहलू में आंख में see the flow, this flow is beautiful. दिल में जिगर में सीने में पहलू में आंख में ऐ इश्क तेरी शोला फशानी कहाँ नहीं पूछो न हाले जार मेरा तुमसे क्या कहूं don't ask me what is my condition. What can I say? Gum karda rahe baag hoon, yaad aashiyan nahi. I'm lost in this, Baghi Wafa, and I don't remember where is my own nest, where is my own house. और पूछो ना हाल जार मेरा तुमसे क्या कहूं गुम करदा राहे बाग हूं याद आशियां नहीं हम भी खरीद लेते तेरे जुल्म के लिए बाजार दहर में कोई दिल की दुकान नहीं. So in our play, the play which I am creating, it is not a fictitious play. Dagh is writing beautiful poetry, praising her beauty, her capacity, her scholarship, and and she's also writing poetry. So two artists will be there. One actor and one dancer. So we are creating this play, and I think within 2-3 months we'll be able to complete it, and rehearsals, will start, and it will be a beautiful experience. You can access, some of her work on YouTube also by writing Manjari Chaturvedi, and I have been writing for Manjari Chaturvedi, and we have been documenting the life of Tawaifs and how Tawaifs influence Bollywood. So there's a very famous, production which was performed in Rekhta also. That is Begums and Baijis of Bollywood, which was written by me, and it was performed by Manjari Chaturvedi with the help of some actors. So this is it. This is my brief, intro of the kind of work which we are trying to do here in India.
So I hope with all the trouble that you would see why I was insisting on this invocation of Dagh, it of course mirrors the plot of Dagh meeting Munni by Hijab. It also is interesting because it is a re-inscription of Dagh, both textually, as you would say, by invocation of his ghazal. It is also a wordplay on Dagh's name, in which case it is used 3 times: the stain on the cloth, the name of the poet, but also a larger invocation of the poet's legacy itself, where she then assigned him the role of Dagh. And indeed, the storyline kind of mirrors in some way the storyline of Dagh's own life. So in the drama, there is a very interesting way in which Dagh has been used by Mira Nair to think about the relationship between a courtesan and a respectable person. So this is the reason I thought it was interesting to bring this performance of a Dagh's ghazal by in fact being performed by a courtesan character in 2021. And it still works in a very interesting way. So sorry for the long digression, but I hope people can see why I was insisting on the word Dagh.
Thank you.